At Affirmations, our mission is to be a welcoming space where people of all sexual orientations, gender identities, and expressions and cultures can find support and unconditional acceptance, and where they can learn, grow, socialize, and feel safe. And our vision is to be an evolving community center where all who gather are embraced and are free to be their authentic selves. So while our programming at Affirmations is targeted towards LGBTQ identified individuals, a lot of it is open to anyone, including our allies, to be able to participate in. So free and open for everyone. Some examples of our programs and services include our Youth Empowerment Program, which is kind of the umbrella term for all the different youth programs that we do. One of the main ones is our Youth Leadership and Development Program, which is a 16-week curriculum-based program for youth ages 13 to 22 to learn self-advocacy and workforce development skills. We also have a drop-in center for youth ages 13 to 18. Right now, because we are still closed for COVID and trying to figure out how we're navigating that, we have a virtual drop-in through Discord where a lot of the youth are able to chat and network with each other. And we do other things as well. We have, usually we have a summer theater intensive, but unfortunately that got postponed because of COVID. A Pride Prom, which also got postponed because of COVID. The youth programs got hit pretty hard because of COVID, but we still plan on running all of them and making things as available as possible. We also have support and discussion groups for all ages. So we serve individuals from teens all the way up through senior citizens. Our biggest support and discussion group is actually our Senior Coffee Klatch group, which meets weekly and discusses topics of being LGBTQ and an elder. We've also got transgender support groups, coming out groups, even some like fun activity groups like the Book and Film Club, Game Night, and a Magic the Gathering Club. So a lot of different things. And again, many of those groups are open to anyone. So definitely feel free to check those out. We have health and wellness resources as well. Through partner organizations, we offer HIV and STD testing on a regular basis, along with our counseling services program, where we work with an MSW to oversee counseling interns who offer services at free or reduced rates, so that people within the community can receive culturally competent care. And then social activities, including when the center is open, our recreation room and our cyber cafe. So again, lots of things to do at Affirmations. Some group expectations for the day, just for while I'm presenting. If you have questions, one of my personal policies is to always assume best intentions. If you've come to this presentation, I'm guessing that you're here to learn, and thus, if you ask a question and you don't necessarily know the right terminology or how to say it, I'm not going to get offended by anything that you ask because I'm here to help you understand. Respect each other. We're all here at different levels in our understanding. Some people may have never heard any of the terms or information that I'm going to share. Others might be very familiar with these topics. So just understanding that we're all coming from different spaces, but for the same purpose of reaching a mutual understanding. Calling in, not calling out. When I do presentations, I like to follow the idea that while calling out someone for something that seems offensive is a good way to stop an issue in the moment, it doesn't always work for education, and because I'm here to help people understand, and including myself, if I say something that somebody disagrees with, I like to go with calling in, which is where we have a conversation about what's going on in the moment. So that way we can find out what happened, the impact that it had, and how we can move forward. And at any point in the meeting chat, if you're unsure of something I'm saying, if something's unclear or doesn't make sense, feel free to ask for clarification. I will answer questions as I can. So why is LGBTQ advocacy so important? We hear a lot of the different negative statistics around mental health for LGBTQ individuals, and these are some examples of those statistics. LGBTQ individuals are almost 3 times more likely to experience a mental health condition than our heterosexual counterparts. With youth, suicide is one of the leading causes of death for LGBTQ individuals ages 10 to 24, only behind accidental death. While 1 in 2 transgender individuals have attempted suicide at some point in their life. Substance use is also almost 3 times the amount as the general population, and 57% of transgender identified individuals report being rejected by their immediate family. So there's a lot of grim statistics that show that it's really hard for LGBTQ individuals to navigate, as well as just not necessarily having access to the same healthy coping skills and self-care that other individuals might have access to. But I think along with that and with those statistics, it's important to talk about how resilient our community is as well. There are a lot of studies that show that LGBTQ individuals are actually some of the most resilient individuals that there are. And a study by Lighthouse LGBTQ plus Affirming Care found 6 core strengths that LGBTQ individuals exhibit that help them with these resiliency factors. Social intelligence being one, that we have insights and experiences that help us with what's considered cognitive flexibility, or really the ability to see things from different perspectives, kind of see things outside the box. For another one, we've got courage, because a lot of us, we face near constant minority stress, and while that can be very difficult, we can turn this into the ability to confront heteronormativity. So when we come out, it does take a courageous step. We have to really assess our own safety and put our identity above that sometimes. But because of that, once we can do that, we can really move against the system and really start to make progress. Empathy. People who are LGBTQ often have a higher level of empathy for the people around them because the coming out process requires a lot of personal insight and reflection. So we've had to really assess ourselves and the journeys that we've been through, and it makes it so that we can better empathize with the struggles that other people, including other people from other minority categories, might have to go through. Authenticity. We live our lives the way that we see the best fit for us. There's a lot of pressure at first for us to conform in one way or another to certain expectations. People want us to be straight, people want us to not come out as transgender. But once we get past that, we actually receive less of the stressors and pressure to conform, because we don't have to necessarily have kids at the same timeline. We don't necessarily have to get married in the same time frame. So we really start to create our own narrative. Resiliency theory is another factor, and this is the idea that our community really focuses a lot on each other and the social support that comes from being within the LGBTQ community. And that social support becomes what's called our family of choice. So even when our biological families reject us, or people who we thought were once important to us, we can positively reframe this into that we still have our family of choice to fall back on. And creativity. This applies to all the other 5 as well, but we have the ability to invent ourselves, and we get to be whoever we want to be. And this way we can actually think outside the box a lot farther than people who just kind of navigate in what they know to be true. We have to really come to terms with it. So we get to have all these different factors that make us a really unique individual. So with all of that, I've been using the acronym LGBTQ quite a bit. So let's talk about what that acronym means. And actually, I call this presentation the Quiltbag for no reason other than it's a more fun way to put the letters into an acronym. It's a fun word and it makes people think about it, but it means the same thing as LGBTQ. So when we're talking about that, one of the categories that we are talking about is sexuality and sexual orientation. And this is a term that means how somebody is physically or romantically attracted to somebody else. It's important to know that this is a self-defined term. So even if somebody has certain behaviors or activities that might make them fall into a category based on the definition of that term, somebody does not have one of these sexualities unless they themselves specify that this is who they are. Also, sexuality can be very fluid. For some people, they might be really sure of their sexuality, but later on in life realize that maybe it's different than what they've always known. And that's okay too. Also, textbook definitions help us understand these different terms, but they can mean something different to other individuals. So it's really good to find out exactly how somebody identifies through conversation. We're probably familiar with the terms lesbian, gay, bisexual, and heterosexual because those are the most commonly used terms for sexuality. But there are many more. I noticed that Trisha just shared the link to our resource guides, and in there is a LGBTQ definitions guide that's about 10 pages long. There's a lot of different terms within the community. And I think what's important to know is that we don't need to remember or memorize every single term and definition because they're always changing. And really, one way that you can affirm somebody if you don't know the term that they're using for their identity is ask. You can affirm somebody by letting them know, hey, that's really great that you can tell me your identity. Could you please tell me what that means to you? And that allows them to really explain it and helps with the individuality of identity. Some of the other terms on this slide that are fairly commonly used in the LGBTQ community include pansexual, which is a term for individuals where gender is not necessarily a deciding factor in attraction. Asexual are individuals who feel limited to no sexual attraction. And demisexual is a term for somebody who needs to feel a intellectual or romantic connection before they can feel a sexual attraction. So again, really the most important part about sexuality and sexual orientation is letting people tell you what that means to them. Another term that you might hear within the LGBTQ community, and thus the Q on the end of that, is queer. Queer is actually a highly debated term still within the community because it's been what's called reclaimed. So at one point in time, queer was very much used as a derogatory term, and in some regions and communities, it is still used as a slur against us. But on a broad scale, the LGBTQ community has started using it as a label and as an identifier, which takes away the power from the people who are using it as a slur. Queer can be used as an identity term. So some people might identify as queer, other people might use it to describe the community on the whole. But one important factor about queer is that even if somebody identifies that way, it's important to know if they're okay with you using that term for them. Another thing about queer is that different generations are less comfortable. Actually, our senior group still uses the acronym LGBT because they are not comfortable with the term queer. And I see a question about the difference between pansexual and bisexual. So I'll answer that real quick before I finish queer. Bisexual and pansexual are very similar. They fall under kind of the same umbrella of attraction, but the way that I've heard the differences best defined is that bisexual individuals are attracted to people of the same gender of themselves and different genders. And gender is part of the attraction. So they might be attracted to like masculinity or femininity, but there is still some relevance to the gender with the attraction, while pansexuality is a lot more about the kind of that intellectual romantic connection, and then the gender really is just more of a descriptor. It's not something that they feel has a deciding factor in the attraction. So I hope that answers that question. With queer, queer is also an academic term. In certain situations and settings in universities, you can study what's called queer theory, which is actually the study of anything outside of the heterosexual norm. So I studied it a little bit while I was in college, and it is becoming more and more common as a study. And queer is also very much a political statement. So individuals who are in activism and are going out and doing a lot of this work will often identify as queer because it's a way to capture people's attention. If you're not in the LGBTQ community regularly and you don't hear people using this term, it can really grab your attention because you do still hear it kind of as a slur, and it really opens up a dialogue. So again, queer is one of those terms where it's sort of okay to use, but definitely be sure that the people you're talking to are okay with its use. So the next topic is gender identity and expression. So the first thing to understand the difference between is sex and gender. So when we're talking about gender identity, we want to know that when we're referring to sex, we're talking about somebody's biological sex characteristics. And while we often use sex and gender interchangeably, this is actually false. So sex is specific to the chromosomes and the body type of the individual, while gender is how somebody represents themselves to the world and how they are perceived by the world around them. So gender identity is really innate to the brain, while biological sex is the body. Gender identity is self-defined. A lot of times it's based in societal expectations, but it is how we choose to navigate and how we choose to present ourselves. With that, there is a difference between gender identity and gender expression. So gender identity, again, is who we are and how we see ourselves, but gender expression is how we show that to the world. So that can be how we dress, it can be if we like to wear makeup, it can be how we do our hair, it can even be our mannerisms. So gender expression is also somewhat separate from gender identity because for some individuals, their gender expression may not directly align with what's expected of their gender identity. Some common examples of this are such as women who like to dress more masculinely, men who like to dress more femininely, or having like a fluidity with those different topics, because we really want to express ourselves in a way that makes us feel comfortable, and it is a way of showing individuality. So identity is who we are, expression is how we show it. Some terms that are important when talking about gender identity are cisgender is one. Cisgender is a term for individuals who identify with the gender expected of their sex assigned at birth. So this means that cisgender is an individual who, say, is assigned female at birth on their birth certificate, and they still identify as a woman today. That hasn't changed. It's who they are. That individual would be considered cisgender. Conversely, like myself, who is transgender, these are individuals whose gender identity is different than what's expected of their sex assigned at birth. So because I was assigned female at birth, but I identify as transgender today, or I identify as a man today, that makes me transgender. Another important note about terms around being transgender, when I say that I'm a transgender man, the gender term that comes after transgender is how an individual currently identifies. So because I currently identify as a man and I am transgender, that makes me a transgender man. In the same way with transgender women, if they were assigned male at birth and identify as female today, they would be considered a transgender woman. Another term to be aware of is non-binary or genderqueer. And these are gender identities that fall outside of the what's called the gender binary, which is where we often assume that there is just men and women for gender categories. But the reality is there is an infinite amount of gender identities that exist. Again, in that definitions packet, you'll find a lot of different terms that fall under this non-binary umbrella. But the reality is non-binary identities very much have the concept that it's either a combination of the binary of man and woman, it could be something different, or nothing at all. So one of the things people often misstep on is thinking that non-binary is a new type of terminology, but actually non-binary is more something that has existed for forever, as long as gender has existed. but we haven't always recognized it because it was lost during a lot of different colonization efforts. So if you look at different ancient cultures, including some Native American cultures and some ancient Asian cultures, you'll actually find records of third, fourth, and fifth gender identities outside of man and woman. But now we're just starting to once again recognize that these gender differences exist. Some other terms that I want to bring up, masculine and feminine. These are ways that we often describe different characteristics. I've even used them in this presentation, but everyone defines masculine and feminine a little bit differently. They're often based in expectation, and it's how we can describe things because people have a perception of what those mean. But again, not everybody sees something that's masculine as masculine or something as feminine. We just all have different perceptions. And another term is agender. This is a term that falls under non-binary and genderqueer, but it's the concept that somebody navigates without a gender identity, or that gender identity just doesn't necessarily, they haven't found a term or solution that fits to what their identity is. And again, many more. Definitely look at those resource guides and those definitions packets because it'll show you just how broad of identity spectrum can be. Another important topic to talk about is that when we're talking about biological sex, it's not as simple as just male and female. Intersex is also a legitimate biological sex, but unfortunately in most states, it's not a designation that can be made on a birth certificate. And intersex is the concept of a person who is born with either chromosomal differences outside of the XX and the XY, or biological characteristics that don't fit what's considered the typical of a male or a female baby. And the sexual anatomy and chromosomal differences thus make the individual fall into an intersex category. Now, there's not a lot of information around intersex at this time because historically babies were operated on without parental consent. And this actually occurred all the way up until 1991. So fairly recently, a lot of people who have these operations and their parents didn't even know are only just finding out that they are intersex. I actually have a good friend of mine that suspected it for a while, but found out for sure by accident through a 23andMe, because most of the time, unless there's a health issue, we don't have chromosome tests to prove one way or another. It's just not something that we do. It's a very expensive test, and if it's not medically necessary, we don't do it. So through the 23andMe, she found out that she actually has XXY chromosomes. And still to this day, babies are operated on for being intersex, but parents have to give consent for that operation. That operation is based on a doctor's call and what their perception of abnormal genitalia is. But one thing to know is that most of the time, if ever, there aren't complications around letting somebody grow up as intersex, at least until puberty. If there are going to be complications, it's not going to happen until much later down the road, at which point the individual can decide for themselves what they want to do with their bodies. But again, we don't have the designation for birth certificates, so it's just good to understand that even biological sex goes outside of what we have learned and been raised to understand. For many trans and non-binary individuals, we'll go through what's called the transition process. And this is something I briefly mentioned about myself. And transition is a social and or medical term for aligning one's body and expression with their gender identity. So the social part of transition is when we as trans and non-binary individuals come out, we tell people the name and pronouns that we want to be referred to as, and we navigate the world within the identity that we've chosen. The medical aspect, on the other hand, is for individuals who want to seek hormone replacement therapy or gender-affirming surgeries to align their body with how they perceive themselves. Some trans and non-binary people may elect to have these procedures, while others may go without. There are a lot of reasons why people might choose not to go through a medical transition process. Some people just feel comfortable enough in their bodies that they don't need a medical transition. Others might have medical complications that make it that they can't have these different medical interventions. But also very frequently, a lot of trans and non-binary individuals can't afford medical transition. For hormone replacement therapy, many insurances still do not cover this type of treatment. They consider it elective, and most insurances still do not cover gender affirming surgeries and consider them elective procedures. And if you know anything about kind of the nuances of being trans and some of the socioeconomic things around it, transgender and non-binary individuals often face higher rates of underemployment or unemployment and are often more in the poverty categories than our cisgender counterparts. So as it is, we don't have access to a lot of money, and then we're being told that these are elective procedures and we don't need them. But I'll go into a little bit why it's not really elective. It is life-saving. But with that, an example is that my top surgery, like having my breast tissue removed, was not covered by insurance, and I went to Florida to have it done because that was where I thought the surgeon who could do the best work was. So with travel costs, it was about $10,000 out of pocket for me to have surgery. And that's on the lower end. Top surgery is one of the cheaper surgeries when it comes down to it. So understanding that there's a lot of different reasons why people might choose not to transition or just socially transition, and understanding that everybody's journey is different. There is no one cookie cutter way to be trans. There's no one single sex change operation. It's not that simple. So just respecting that everybody will have their own route to get to being comfortable in their own bodies and their own identities. One of the reasons that many individuals might choose to both socially transition and medically transition is gender dysphoria. And gender dysphoria has two different definitions. The first being the diagnostic definition, which is what many trans and non-binary individuals need to receive from a therapist or a psychiatrist to actually go through the transition process medically. And the diagnostic definition is a conflict between one's physical and assigned gender and the gender by which the individual identifies. So this is the concept that we do have a disconnect between who we are physically and who we are in our minds. At one point, this was considered gender identity disorder. That was the term that was used until 2010. But through a lot of different studies of trans and non-binary individuals, it was found that the identity itself was not the disorder. We definitely know who we are as people. It's the symptoms that come along with it that cause mental distress. And gender dysphoria is also that symptom. So that's the other definition. And the actual symptom of gender dysphoria is having a significant distress and or problems functioning associated with the conflict between a person's gender identity and their physical or social characteristics. So this is a very strong disassociation with certain parts of the body, not really recognizing who the person is in the mirror because of how we perceive ourselves. But it is very much a mental distress associated with our gender identity not aligning with our bodies. There are a lot of myths around gender dysphoria. All of these that I have listed were either said to me or to some of the youth that I work with. And I think that it's just important to address why our transition processes look different for everyone. For some of the younger people I work with, they've heard that everybody feels uncomfortable with their bodies at your age. This is kind of a really simple way to dismiss gender dysphoria because gender dysphoria goes far beyond just being uncomfortable. One of the ways that I recognized the difference was because until I was in college, I didn't realize that other women did not have the same absolute hatred of having breasts that I did. Some people are uncomfortable with them, some people don't necessarily like them, but wanting them gone wasn't something that everybody felt. Like that wasn't a traditional thing. Another concept is that you need to feel physical dysphoria to be transgender. For some individuals, they may not define it as dysphoria. It may simply be that they know in their heads that they are this gender and that the way they've been referred to their whole life is not accurate. But you don't actually have to feel that disassociation with your body to have a different gender identity than what's expected of you. Two of the other ones that I've heard from many of my youth, they've been told that if you just don't think about your body or look in a mirror, you'll be fine, or that body positivity can help fix their gender dysphoria. But again, it's much deeper than simply learning to love your body or just not looking in a mirror, because it is something that you feel every single day, and you know that you're not navigating the world in a way that you feel comfortable. And then finally, some folks think that there's a certain age range that you're too young to have dysphoria or be transgender, but there have been some recent studies that show that by the age of 4, youth, whether they're raised and socialized to fall into a certain gender category, or if they're raised neutrally, they are able to articulate what their gender is to the people around them. So as early as age 4, we can already tell people who we are as a person, but it's often dismissed because somebody is young. So just understanding that there's a lot of different factors that play into gender dysphoria, but also a lot of different ways people try to dismiss it. When we're trying to assist other people with their gender dysphoria to help them feel more comfortable, one important aspect is having access to gender-affirming clothing items and different things like that. One that I like to talk about is chest binders. So chest binders are specifically an item that helps compress the breast tissue against the body in a safe manner so that you have the appearance of a flat chest. But the only way to really access these are through the internet or adult stores. So for many youth and young adults, there's not really an easy way for them to get chest binders. So they'll often turn to things like ace bandages or duct tape, which can cause serious damage and permanent damage to the body, including damage to the breast tissue, injury to the lungs, and broken ribs. Same with gaffs, which are for trans feminine individuals who are trying to hide the appearance of their lower region. They will also sometimes turn to things like duct tape, and again, that can cause permanent damage. So helping people gain access to different gender-affirming clothing and neutral options as possible. Therapy and counseling is also really important for trans and non-binary individuals, but a therapist that is knowledgeable about gender expansiveness and gender expansive youth, because one of the hardest things to go through as a trans person is going to a therapist and having to explain to them what it means to be transgender, what dysphoria is, and why you now have to navigate the world with these different issues. We on our website for Affirmations, the health and wellness one, link, we've got some links to different affirming therapists. There are quite a few in this area, but trans people often go by word of mouth on a lot of that stuff because our experiences tend to speak the loudest. Support groups for young people do exist, and some of the ones that I often refer people to are Stand with Trans. They've got groups for both young individuals who identify as trans or non-binary and parents alike. Affirmations has a lot of transgender resources. Transcend the Binary is another great one. We work with them through Affirmations, and they've got an extensive list of different like doctors and therapists that are good. They do patient advocacy, peer counseling, nutrition and wellness. And actually, in reference to one of the questions that just came up about funding resources for special supplies and surgeries, Transcend the Binary, at least for hormone therapy, they can't give the hormones, but they do help people get access to sterile needles for injections. There are some resources like GC2B is a binder company, and they will sometimes do binder giveaways. And then you can find different funds throughout the internet. I don't know all of them offhand, but there are different fundraisers and things that independent trans organizations do to help people gain access to resources. So like I said, looking directly at some of the companies that sell these resources, especially for like binders and gaffs and stuff. And then surgical funds, they are around. Transcend the Binary might actually have better knowledge of where to look for that too. One of the easiest ways to affirm somebody's gender identity is through using their correct pronouns and chosen name. And really, this can be a huge impact on somebody's gender dysphoria, because if we're being affirmed for who we are, even if we don't necessarily appear as the gender that we're identifying as, it can really minimize the dysphoria, because we're getting the respect and we're navigating the world as our identity. So just doing our best that if we know someone is trans or non-binary, to use those pronouns and name that they go by. And allowing the space to not be okay sometimes. If you know a trans or non-binary individual, it's really important to just let them have their emotions about it. Sometimes you might just be the safest person for them to let those emotions out about how difficult it can be. So being a support system. There's another great question. Is Affirmations limited in the types of support they can provide to minors if parents or guardians disagree? Somewhat. That's a really good question. So a lot of our programs are kind of informed consent in a way. We have the youth fill out paperwork to attend the program, but we don't necessarily need parental permission for them to be in the program. It's why we focus on 13 and up, because they do have a little more autonomy at that point. We do have some parents that disagree with the youth coming. Well, we've got a lot of parents that disagree with the youth coming in. Like, if I'm being honest, I've got more parents that don't want them there than do. But like, our counseling services are only for 18 plus because of this. So for counseling services, we'll often refer out, often to Common Ground Sanctuary, because they do a lot of really great interventions with parents and youth. For the different like affirming resources that we can provide, just from my own personal collection from before I had top surgery, I've given out a lot of my binders, and we refer to Transcend the Binary. But yes, under 18 can be very difficult, especially for trans and non-binary kids, because there aren't a lot of resources for them until they turn 18. I don't know if that answers your question, but some other ways that we can create safe spaces for gender nonconformity. These are just some of the concepts that I've come up with. Embracing exploration of identity, even from a young age. It's actually been shown that for young individuals, especially those that are being socialized as young men, if they're allowed to participate in things that are generally considered feminine, whether that's dressing up in dresses or cooking, playing with dolls, it creates a much greater sense of empathy later on in life. Because when you take the gender out of it, it makes it so that the idea of femininity isn't necessarily considered a negative thing, and it fights against the concept of toxic masculinity. In the same sense, we want to abolish gender stereotypes and expectations. So when we're referring to different job roles or different chores around the house or different things that we do, not referring to them as like a man's job or a woman's job, but per the individual who's doing these different things. Because we all know that our careers are not based in our gender. Instead, they're based in our capabilities. Encourage open communication about identities. So being able to feel safe and be able to have those discussions when somebody is struggling with their identity. Assisting with informing others of pronouns. So if you know that somebody is out as a different name and pronouns than what people are used to, and they're trying to navigate in that way, having the ability to correct people if they're getting it wrong. Because as trans and non-binary individuals, we often have to correct people all the time on our pronouns. So being somebody that can say, hey, this person actually goes by he, him. And that way you can step up and be an ally in that moment. And provide patience and foster a caring environment. Realizing that you're trans or non-binary and coming out as such is a long process. And for a lot of us, we might have to try on different names or different pronouns. and really put in the effort to realize ourselves. And for people around us, it can sometimes get a little frustrating because we might be changing our name, and it might be unexpected, and you have to keep relearning it with us. But just try your best to be patient and understand that this is somebody's journey to self-actualization, and you're there to support them through it. Some other points about importance of identity is that for individuals in this community of being LGBTQ, we often face a lot of different risks of discrimination, whether or not we're actually out. Discrimination based on our appearance, so if somebody perceives us to be LGBTQ, is often what causes harassment, hostility, and violence. So when you hear about different hate crimes, it's most often because somebody thought that somebody was LGBTQ. They didn't even have evidence one way or another. If we can't be out as who we are in our gender identity, people will be disrespecting our name and pronouns because they don't know. And they can't use the right ones because we don't feel safe to give them that information. And even though we've had some great progress in the Supreme Court around employment law, so Title VII was just ruled that the definition of sex under Title VII does protect sexual orientation and gender identity, but right now it only covers employment. So we can still lose different access to things like housing. Religious exemption acts make it harder for us to receive medical care. So there are still a lot of different discriminations, and again, based on that perception. But being out and being able to be affirmed allows us to be more authentic with ourselves and live fully in our lives. Our stress actually becomes reduced when we can come out because we don't have to worry about hiding that identity from the people around us. We develop closer and more genuine relationships with those around us because they do know our true and authentic selves. And we can build our self-esteem. So this is a really great way that when we come out and somebody does affirm us, it does make us feel better as an individual. Another great question. So the question is, recently Webster's Dictionary made a huge step in adding the mix or MX as gender-neutral honorific like Mr. or Mrs. or Miss. I know that this title has gained popularity over the years. Do you see this move by Webster's to affirm and validate the honorific as something that will encourage more non-cis folks in transition to use it? I think it's definitely something that'll be helpful, especially when we're talking about non-binary recognition, because there isn't really an honorific until we recognize this as a valid term for somebody who doesn't identify as a man or a woman. So I think recognizing the mix honorific will help other people in the coming out process. And I also think that the biggest things about this, and I'll talk about it too with the they them pronouns in a little bit, is that having these different gender neutral concepts in the dictionary also takes away the argument that people make as to why we shouldn't use them. Because a lot of times people will argue like, oh, that's not grammatically correct, so I don't need to respect it. But Merriam-Webster and Oxford dictionaries alike have been really making progress in showing that actually we've now deemed it completely grammatically correct in the English language. So it takes away that power from the people who are just trying to be discriminatory. So yeah, I'm excited about it. And then one of the reasons that we do really need to talk about LGBTQ inclusion is because oppression still very much exists in this world. There are a lot of different oppressions that people who are LGBTQ face, but two of the main ones that I like to talk about are the institutional oppression, or the rules and policies that keep our community from equality. These often stem from religious or cultural beliefs that have been interwoven in society and still hang around today. And these often translate into internalized oppression. And these are negative beliefs, feelings, or values that even after we come out as LGBTQ, we still have resonate. So one of the things that we like to talk about with internalized depression is that we have to unlearn all of these negative biases that we've been taught to really feel comfortable in ourselves, but also to feel comfortable as part of this community. And then there's another great question. Do we have any faith leaders support your agency? Yes, we do, to some degree. We work with a lot of different churches and organizations around the area. A couple examples are MCC is the church. I can't remember what that stands for, but they are a church that is actually run by LGBTQ individuals. There are a couple of Unitarian Universalist churches that I have been working with. I actually just did a presentation for one on Sunday. A few UCC churches as well have been really wonderful and accepting. So we do have some of those in our resource guides, as well as their information available at the center. So it does tend to fall more on the like Christian end of the faith leaders that are working with us right now, but we're like more than certainly open. And actually, I should mention that we have in the past received funding from the Jewish Fund for some of our programming, so we have had a lot of involvement that way. I have a presentation coming up on Friday with Jewish Vocational Services, so we're definitely getting more into different faith organizations as well. So I hope that answers that question too. And then we've got the concept of intersectionality, which plays into the different oppressions that people face. So while I talked about the oppressions LGBTQ people face, we usually don't face just oppression on that basis. For many of us, we also face oppression based on other marginalized categories such as race or ethnicity, socioeconomic status, and because of this, these inequalities often become significantly more complex because as marginalization increases, the amount of harassment or discrimination we face becomes more exponential, and we can't always recognize exactly why we're facing the issues that we're facing. So one of the reasons we need to recognize intersectionality is because everybody's journey is different, and when somebody is really struggling, oftentimes it's multi-layered. It's not just because of one identity or another, and we have to see people as full individuals when we're working with them. Oh, this is just a really good point, and I want to read it out loud. Affirming parents may need to be explicit, offering to shop for clothing, welcoming friends, and giving their gender-expansive children to be out in the home, even if not out to the world. Yes, I completely agree with that. One of the biggest issues that a lot of trans non-binary youth face is just the fear that they can't come out at home. So if you are an affirming parent, definitely make it as obvious as possible. Which kind of goes into the next topic of conversation, and that's the concept of brave spaces. So a lot of individuals will talk about the idea of a safe space, which I think is very important as well. And a safe space is a place where people of all sorts of different backgrounds and identities can feel affirmed and welcomed in their identity. But a brave space is much like a safe space, but it is a place where we can talk about intense conversations around difficult topics, such as discrimination of LGBTQ people, racism in the world. Brave spaces are somewhere where we can come together and be affirmed, but still really address some of those hard topics. Creating a brave space takes a little more work and effort. We have to create ground rules for the group when we're creating a brave space. So being able to really understand what respect is going to look like. Make sure all voices can be equally heard, because when you're having hard conversations, sometimes you'll get somebody who's very passionate and has a lot to say, which can sometimes make somebody else feel like they have to remain quiet. So letting the floor be open to anybody who has something to share on the topic. Giving breaks when needed, because a lot of times when we're talking about these difficult topics, things can become very emotional. So making sure that there is space to have a breather and come back. And then in a brave space, it's also important to avoid simply discussing the problem. Sometimes we can find ourselves saying, yes, this is a problem in the world. It's terrible that this is going on, but we don't do anything about it. So in a brave space, it's important to start producing solutions to problems that are identified. An example could be if you're talking about an issue occurring in a workplace, like let's say you're finding that people who identify as trans or non-binary are not having their pronouns or names respected, maybe talking about who to go to discuss a policy to change, to make that something that is required, that we do respect people for their name and pronouns. And then addressing bias is another important part in a safe or a brave space. Like I talked about early on, calling in versus calling out. When we call people out, it really isn't to teach the person who's doing something wrong, because we do often have a knee-jerk reaction. So if somebody tells me that I'm being homophobic, usually I'm not like, oh, okay, because it does come across as sort of an insult, but it's not. Like, you're trying to educate me, but you're also trying to stop my poor behavior. Calling out really shows other people around you that you don't stand for the behavior. Calling in, on the other hand, is the educational aspect. So that's where we might say, hey, I hear what you're saying, but I'm not sure I agree with that. What do you think that means? That works really well, too, with like racially or LGBT insensitive jokes, things like that. Because if somebody says something and they're laughing and you go, I don't understand, can you explain that joke to me? They have to actually talk it out, which more often than not gets somebody to realize that what they said wasn't okay. When we're being allies to any community, it's important that we keep our cool in these conversations. Allyship isn't always about convincing people what is, quote, right. We might try to find ourselves changing people's minds, but a lot of time the work that we're doing is for the person that we are trying to defend from the bias. So if there is somebody in the group that is hearing a biased conversation or reading it, online and social media is one place where we often do this. If we're pointing out that somebody has done something that is biased or insensitive, by us stating our views, we're showing that the space that we're in doesn't stand for it, even if somebody is getting away with saying it. And then we might choose to make our stances public, sharing things on social media, whether that's our personal social media or things related to our organization, showing that we are somebody who is an ally and stands behind being LGBTQ. We might want to demonstrate our pride, whether that's by displaying a rainbow flag, or showing that we're a safe space, or talking about our different roles in allyship, and bringing pride into daily conversations. We want to talk about the people in our life who identify as LGBTQ. We want to talk about our own experiences, and we want to make it something that really does become a part of everyday life. I've touched a bit on pronouns, but just to kind of summarize them, pronouns are how we refer to somebody in lieu of using their name. So for myself, when I said I use he, him pronouns, that's what you use to replace instead of saying Ian in a sentence. So that would be like, he is speaking, I listen to him. These different examples are often used for individuals who do identify on the more masculine end. He, him is usually used. Conversely, she, her is often used for individuals who identify more femininely. They, them, theirs is often used for individuals who are identifying as non-binary or gender neutral. But also it's important to know that they, them is also considered the kind of default pronoun. So if you don't know somebody's pronoun, they, them is a really good one to use so that you're not making assumptions. And then there are a lot of other gender neutral pronouns. Z, here, and here's, and Z, zir, and zirs are a couple of examples. They didn't necessarily gain as much traction as they, them, theirs, a lot just because we already recognized they, them, theirs as a pronoun. So it was easier for the general population to adapt. But some individuals might still choose to use these pronouns, so doing our best to respect that. Some other inclusive language topics. Instead of referring to people as a mother or a father, I'm sure a lot of us in the lines of work we do know this, but using parent or guardian, because everybody's dynamics in their family look different. Some people might have two moms, some people might have two dads, some people might be in a foster home or raised by different individuals. So just being respectful of that. Instead of referring to somebody's husband or wife, starting to use terms like partner, significant other, or spouse. This can help with not only just not gendering people or not making assumptions that somebody would be in a straight relationship, but it also shows that people who are straight and are in straight relationships can also use this terminology. I've used these terms quite a bit throughout the presentation, but sex assigned at birth and gender identity. We use sex assigned at birth because we don't want to assume that individuals are male or female, because again, intersex is legitimate. And there aren't many reasons why you would be asking for sex assigned at birth, except for in a medical setting or legal paperwork. Gender identity, conversely, is how we want to most frequently refer to people. So we want to know that so that we're respecting who the person is. Referring to groups of people, trying to remain as neutral as possible with that. So using things like folks, friends, or everyone. Some people will say y'all. It doesn't work very well with me because I'm from Wisconsin and it sounds funny when I say it, but it's okay. Not assuming gender of somebody who you're working with. So referring to them as a person, an individual, a client, a guest. Different ways to refer to the person so that they are still humanized, that they're not seeming like a statistic, but that we aren't assuming their gender. And again, they, them pronouns are a safe default. There are a lot of different ways to be an ally. So if you see or hear something that is not okay, say something about it. Listen non-judgmentally and genuinely to people around you. Protect others' identities. If somebody comes out to you, that means that they trusted you with this information, and it is sensitive information. So unless they say otherwise, don't share that. Respect names and pronouns, trying to get them right as much as possible, trying to adapt to gender-neutral language, and hear the concerns from others, and respect everybody's right to feel affirmed. There's a great question about the difference between folks, spelled F-O-L-K-S, or folks, F-O-L-X. So a lot of the reasons that people will use folks, F-O-L-X, is because it's very gender-neutral, which folks with KS is as well. But a lot of times we use folks with an X because it's considered also more inclusive of people of color. Because a lot of individuals in communities of color have been starting to use that type of language to show gender neutrality. So it's a bit more broad and encompassing than saying folks with a KS. I hope that helps. So another thing about being an ally is recognizing when you've made a mistake. And there are two ways that we often find out we've made mistakes. Either we catch ourselves in the moment and realize that we said something silly, or somebody corrects us. When somebody corrects us, accept the feedback, regardless of how we feel about it, because sometimes we may not agree that what we did was discriminatory, but either way, it impacted a person in the moment, and we want to validate those feelings. If you're unsure what happened and somebody becomes upset, respectfully ask for clarification. We can't learn and grow, and we can't change our behavior if we don't know what we did. So simply saying, hey, I notice you're upset and I hear you. Can you let me know what happened so that we can move forward? And then doing our best to correct the behavior at hand. In the same way, if you catch yourself making a mistake, make a brief apology. A lot of times when we apologize, we get really upset and worked up, and we'll continue to apologize for a long period of time. But that actually draws more attention to what happened than simply showing that you're ready to move on beyond it, and the apology becomes about you. So a good example is that if you say get somebody's pronouns wrong, simply saying, oh, I'm sorry, he, and continuing the conversation. It shows that you care enough to recognize their pronouns, that it was a simple mistake, but other people in the room aren't going to notice anything other than you might have been talking too fast and slipped on somebody's pronouns. And then allies are a part of our community, and I think that it's an important note to end on, that allies, while it is an identity, I do like to remind people that it's an action term. Ally is an identity that we earn based on those actions, not how we self-define ourselves. So in the community, sometimes I'll hear people talk about the concept of a bad ally, like somebody who says they're an ally but doesn't do the work. And to me, there's no such thing as a bad ally, because if you are being discriminatory still and calling yourself an ally, or you're making people stay in the closet, or you're not being affirming, you're not an ally. You can say it as much as you want, but you're not one. Allies stand up for the LGBTQ community in a variety of ways. It can be as big as going to a rally, signing petitions, talking about different LGBTQ topics on a broad platform, or it can be as simple as being somebody who people feel safe to come out to, somebody that an LGBTQ person can talk to. Because if you make a difference to one person in the LGBTQ community, you make a difference to the entire community. Allies are generally defined as straight folks who are helping out with the community, but you also can be within the LGBTQ community and be an ally. I myself can be an ally to my trans sisters of color, because as a white passing trans man, I do not receive the same discrimination and violence that my trans sisters of color do. And I will never understand exactly what it's like to navigate the world in that sense, but I can help elevate their voices and help educate other people in their rights and their right to basic human rights. And allies can lend their voices to the fight for equality. So when it's not safe for an LGBTQ person to speak up, an ally definitely should step in and say, hey, this is not an okay thing and we need to change it. But also should make space for people who are LGBTQ to be able to share their stories. So also creating that platform for us to be able to come up and speak about our own experiences. And that's all I have presentation-wise. So I can take some questions now if we want.
Great, thank you, Ian, so much. I do want to ask people, you can continue to ask questions in the chat, but there's also a raise your hand feature here in Teams that will help, with the 40 people that we have on this webinar as well. So yeah, if you have any questions, raise your hand or put them in the chat. And again, we are recording this, so it will be available along with the webinar that Ian did last week. So I see we have one question from Amy.
Yeah, it's just looking at it. So the question is about that over 20 years ago, the individual attended a training on LGBTQ issues, and they were invited to purchase a sign, a mug with a pink triangle reading safe space so others recognize the person. This is something that people still do. Actually, on my college campus that I came from, we did what were called safe trainings, which were like 3-hour trainings, and we would issue a triangle at the end of it that said safe zone. It really depends on who and where. My thing about it that I always kind of had an issue with is that just because you go through a training doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be ready to have those conversations. I'm much more of a person that believes that if you are a safe person and you're willing to have those conversations, you'll find a way to get that point across. And also, simply putting up a sign doesn't always necessarily designate a safe person. So I guess like just with practice and finding your own methods tends to be the best way in my opinion. Like I'll see safe zones and I'm like, oh, that's cute. But if I just see somebody with like a random rainbow sticker, a random rainbow pin, that actually like for me, like historically through my coming out process was more of a signal because it was a more personalized way to express that. Ooh, that's a good question. Are there any resources for those within the LGBTQIA+ community who are also dealing with incarceration in jail and prison? I believe Trans Sisters of Color Project does some work around this. Equality Michigan does as well, for sure. And I've been looking a little bit into the Detroit Justice Center. I'm not sure what resources they have for LGBTQ, but I do know they do a lot with like unfair bail practices and different things like that. So I would start with Equality Michigan and go from there.
I'm trying to Google as fast as I can to get the website.
You're doing good. I've noticed you're very quick on that.
Do we have anybody who wants to unmute or raise their hand for any questions?
Oops, not me.
Yeah, I want to say, this is Fran. I want to say it was a great presentation. I learned quite a bit. I am part of that community. And I know what it's like to have a lot of discriminations. And I'm sorry. But it's just, you know, even though I would be considered in the elderly group, I'm still struggling with it. Just because of the way that I have been perceived and how churches have treated me. About 5 years ago, I was evicted out of a church, and to this day, they don't speak to me. And so that's always been really hard on me. But I learned a lot today, and I thank you for your openness, your knowledge, and your concern. Thank you.
Thank you, Fran. And I'm sorry that you had to go through that. And I definitely would encourage you, if you are looking for that sense of community, to definitely look into our Senior Coffee Klatch group. They're currently meeting virtually, but once they meet in person, it might be also a really good experience for you.
Fran, I'll look that up and put the link in the chat, and I can send it to you. We have Kathleen with her hand up. Go ahead, Kathleen. You can unmute yourself.
Sure is on. Using technology isn't always my favorite thing. I do the Facebook page, for P-Flag Ann Arbor. And during the quarantine here in Michigan, have gotten several messages from youth or youth transitioning to adulthood about oppression in the home. And so I have reached out to various organizations to find out what they can do to help these young people who are being abused or are at risk of abuse by their families, because you know, we're not all affirming.
Right.
So do you have you experienced some of this, and what resources can be put into action to assist youth who are in an unfriendly home environment?
Yeah, I've definitely found this with a lot of the youth that we work with. I've had many of them impacted a lot harder than I was hoping, because we all know quarantine was important. We all know stopping the virus is very important. The Discord channel that I came up with for the youth has been really helpful for a lot of them, because so Discord, if you're not familiar, it's a chat app for gamers. So for youth who had access to the internet, if they had it on their devices, like, it just looks like they're a gamer and they're having discussions about gaming. And that way they could be in the AF server and having different conversations about these issues. And we have adults in the server beyond myself. I've got about 4 or 5 that help me moderate it so that the youth have somebody to reach out to when things are really tough. But really, one of our biggest focuses has just been, like, if a youth reaches out to me or reaches out to the center, letting them know that they're loved, because sometimes that's the only thing that you can do.
Thank you. I know that one of the young people that I was hooked up with ended up being moved out of the unwelcoming home and relocated to a friendlier place, which was a great outcome. But there are other kids who live in remote rural areas who just simply have to tough it out. So, letting them know that there are allies out there that they can talk to, even through Discord, is a good, helpful thing for me to know about. Thank you.
And I'm putting my email in the chat, because for them to get access to the Discord, they just have to email me, and I have them fill out a brief form, just so that we're not having any like random not youth in it. But it is open for ages 13 to 20.
13 to 20. Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
We have a question in the chat from Amy about religious trauma impacts many communities. What do you see as needed from faith communities to offer others an opportunity to heal from this?
Ooh, yeah. As somebody who's gone through a little bit of that myself, I definitely know it's an important thing. I guess something that I've seen has been like churches like the UU Church and the UCC Church reaching out, and really working towards understanding, like even though they already had affirming policies, like going beyond that and having LGBTQ people actually like present and be a part of their community. It really helps demonstrate the actual inclusion that they're trying for. But also, I guess, like just speaking from my own experience, finding a community that fit what I needed. I was raised very Catholic. I went to a Calvinist Dutch Reformed high school for 2 years. I didn't have the greatest religious experience with that. But as I got into college, I started exploring more alternative religions. So I fell into kind of like eclectic paganism. And there's actually in Michigan a very large community within that umbrella. They're one of the biggest indoor pagan conventions that's held in the Midwest is held in Dearborn every February. And that's how I really got involved. And that's how I came to Michigan the first time, actually. So I think just knowing that there are a lot of different paths that can be affirming, especially if somebody does feel really disconnected from what their religious practice originally was.
Great, thank you, Ian. We have a question from Tanya.
Hi.
Hey.
I have to say, Ian, I could listen to you all day long. I love your presentation. All of the information is so fantastic, and this has just been great. I was trying to type my question because I was trying to figure out how to articulate it, and Fran speaking is actually really helping me with that, because Fran had shared that story with me at one point, and it makes me feel a little emotional as well. So what I was trying to ask or articulate is, as an ally, especially trying to be effective and navigate conversations without calling people out, and you probably won't be surprised that I'm a caller outer. Most of the years I've gotten much better at it. But I think that one of the things, it's an interesting balance, because you don't want to minimize what the reason you're being an ally for, so the people you're trying to support, what they're going through. But at the same time, I think that allies need to be cognizant of what their triggers are. We're obviously allies for a reason, because it hurts us to see people we care about and we love be treated in such a way. Mm-hmm. So like, even, just hearing Fran and again, remembering that story, and then thinking of some other stories that have happened that I'm aware of, it, you can probably hear it in my voice, my heart hurts, I'm shaky. And, you immediately want to, take up arms and just protect the people you love. So being aware of that and talking about it to somebody and just being, you know, trying to learn how to process it so that you can be an effective ally. So I wanted to bring that up because I've experienced that a lot through the years. And again, I'm better at it now, but like right now, feeling the way that I do right in this moment, it would be really hard for me not to call somebody out. So,
Yeah.
so I wonder if you have any suggestions for that, or even how, you know, if that's something that is addressed in educating allies, because it's a real struggle.
Yeah, and I mean a couple things. One of the things about being an ally that a lot of people forget is the self-care aspect. Because even if you're not the one that's being directly discriminated against, if you're constantly having these arguments and discussions about discrimination, it can take an emotional toll because, like you said, you're fighting for people you care about. So knowing that we can't win every battle, and sometimes it's not worth it. I know a lot of activists that get really wrapped up in social media and fighting people on social media, and then they're just exhausted for days. So really focusing on what the impact is that you're trying for. It's part of why I bring up the point where we're not going to always convince everybody. So assessing in the moment, like, do we think that this is an educational opportunity? I call them my learning moments. And if it's not a learning moment, then maybe just calling out and leaving it there is what we need to do because we've shown, hey, this isn't cool and we're done. But if we do think that it's someone that we can educate, or especially if it's someone that we care about and we know that they don't necessarily mean to be discriminatory, like that's where I really focus on the calling in. Because if you're going to put in the amount of effort to educate, you do want to try to be sure that there is an impact at the end of it.
That's great. Yeah, that's very helpful.
But yeah, even like I do this work. This is what I do. And I have points where I'm just like, this is too much. Like I cannot continue to have this argument. So no matter where you are in that allyship, like you do have to be able to recognize what your limit is too.
Great, thank you, Tanya. Cheryl pointed out in the chat that there is a large LGBTQ plus population in the deaf community.
Yeah, there is.
Do you offer any of your programming or services with sign language at Affirmations?
We don't currently, but especially now that the point was brought up, it's something that I will definitely be bringing up to my boss to see if that's something we can do.
Okay. That's great. That is great. Thank you. Do we have any other questions or comments in the chat, or anybody who wants to unmute? We're coming up on our 12:30 mark, so I don't want to hold you guys too long. Malkaya, thank you. Great, thank you. I'm glad you were able to join us, Malkaya. One thing I think I would ask is, you know, as somebody who oversees diversity initiatives for my organization, what are things we could be doing better to make the workplace a safe place? I did put the link that you had provided me about safe places and workplaces, and I'm definitely looking at that. But, you know, there are quite a few of OCHN employees here and just people from other organizations or even anybody else from, you know, a different sector or where they work at, is what can we do within the workplace?
Yeah, I mean, definitely like looking at different policies that you have around inclusion and trying to make ones that really do focus in on LGBTQ individuals and how to be respectful, having ways to report any bias incidents. Sometimes even anonymous reporting can be really helpful because we don't always want to admit that we had that happen to us. So having a way to contact HR or individuals, and having good mediation practices. So if HR is contacted, having a set way of how they're going to address if there was bias against an LGBTQ person, and having those values and value statements very clearly made to everyone who is within your employment.
Great. Thank you very much. Do we have any other questions, comments, or anything for Ian? All right. Well, if not, I'm going to stop our recording.